Okay, so I just want to give a brief overview of what a carnivore diet is and why I think that it's not just a diet, but it is, as the ketogenic diet has been described, it's a medical intervention. This is something that can significantly help your patient population get out of situations that they may not be able to get out of otherwise. We talked about these so-called non-communicable chronic diseases that make up upwards of 90% of the issues that we treat nowadays as a mainstay of modern medicine. 90% of the deaths in the Western world, 74% of the deaths around the world are these non-communicable chronic diseases. And we say that they're incurable. There's nothing you can do about them, you can just sort of maintain them and hopefully try to mitigate them and slow them down. But as we are seeing in this community with different sorts of diet and lifestyle interventions, you can actually reverse these things. Like we've seen Dr. Unwin with diabetes, like Virta Health, and all these other sorts of great examples of this we've seen presented today. So I just want to go into why that might be, some of these things, and why a carnivore diet might be an even better medical intervention in some of these cases. So what is what is the carnivore diet? Well, first of all, it's a real food diet. It's a whole food diet approach with real foods, made up, boxed sort of nonsense ingredients. We have ketogenic diet, a low carb diet. Okay, but a real food low carb diet, ketogenic diet, so it's like a zero carb diet. But of course, there's the processed ketogenic diet with all the sort of the fake nonsense added to that as well. So we're talking real food, low carb, but even lower carb. And then carnivore diet is a subset of that in. So so a carnivore diet is a ketogenic diet, and it's a real food diet. Okay, so this isn't actually as mysterious or weird or off that people may think that it is. We're eating a lot of meat in a ketogenic diet. It's real food. It's just, okay, we're just only eating that. Okay, well, don't you have to eat plants? No, you actually don't. There's nothing that you're missing from not eating plants, and there's nothing that you're being harmed by only eating meat. Oh, there we go. So why does a carnivore diet work? This is a great illustration that one of our friends here at PHC put together, and it's saying the roots of these chronic diseases: seed oil, sedentary lifestyle, processed foods, lack of sleep, chronic stress, sugar, these sorts of things can cause insulin resistance. And insulin resistance can then bear fruit on all of these horrible, horrible things. And so treating these with a ketogenic diet, and we now have thousands of studies, randomized controlled trials, with large patient populations looking at specific medical endpoints and finding that we can significantly improve the outcomes or sometimes even reverse completely some of these so-called irreversible chronic diseases. So a carnivore diet is a ketogenic diet, and so the same benefits can be applied to a ketogenic carnivore diet as can be found in these randomized controlled trials, and we have quite a lot of them. It is the most nutrient-dense real food diet. So it's a real food diet, but it has real human nutrition. As my friend Ken Berry says, this is a proper human diet, and that's why it's biologically appropriate as well. The reason it's biologically appropriate is because it has all of the essential nutrients that we have to have. We don't miss anything by cutting out plants. There are things in meat that you have to have that you cannot get from plants. There is nothing in plants that you have to have that you cannot get from meat. And there are things that can actually harm you in plants. And so the carnivore diet goes a step further from the ketogenic diet because it removes these potentially harmful phytotoxins, anti-nutrients, and digestive disruptors, hormonal disruptors that we'll get to that show up in plants. So this actually is a proper human diet. This is what humans have been eating for the longest period in human existence, since the early onset of the first true human, Homo habilis, 2.5 million years ago or so. So the thing is that it's really just you eat food until something in your body and brain tells you to stop. This is like every single animal on Earth. Koalas don't need a calculator to figure out the macros. They just eat until something tells them to stop eating. You know, they say, well, everything's scarce out in the wild, so everyone's just fighting for survival. Koalas don't fight for anything. I mean, they're just sitting in a tree. They're living in their natural resource, and they're just eating leaves, and then they stop. So why don't we have fat ones and skinny ones and ones that don't have self-control and some that have diabetes and all these sorts of things? they're just koalas, right? Because they're eating what they're supposed to eat, and so their body's working the way it's supposed to work, and they have these internal gauges and on and off switch. They say, okay, I'm hungry, I'm going to eat, now I don't need to eat anymore. So something in them is telling them how much more they need to eat, and then they stop. So the gauge of a proper human diet is it should be able to do that, and it does. And so you just eat fatty meat until it stops tasting good, and you move on with your life, and your body tells you what you need. So optimal would be these sorts of things. So the whole food meat, eggs, things like that, selected dairy, butter, ghee, things like that, and as a condiment. And so those are great. Those are great. So that's what I would say is what you should use for yourself and for your patients as the optimal side of things. Suboptimal, well, organs are great, but the reason that's in there is that you don't want too much. You can get too much of a good thing. They are the most nutrient-dense part of the animal, and that's great to a point. But if you're eating predominantly those sorts of things, you can actually get hypervitaminosis potentially. There's a potential there. So I try to keep things in proportion with the animal. So if you take out an ox, again, we're trying to think, what were we biologically growing up doing? We were hunting animals, we were killing that animals, we were eating that animal, and so you take down an ox or a mammoth, you're going to have a year or more worth of meat available just on that animal, and it's got one liver, it's got one heart, it's got two kidneys. So try to keep that in proportion, keep that in mind, that it's amazing nutrition, but you don't need much of it. And then things like dairy and yogurt, things like that. And then these things are harmful. These things you don't want to touch. So I think it's as important what not to eat as what to eat. So we eat just whole meat, high fat. We also get that concept from a ketogenic diet point of view. We want a high fat, meat-based diet. But there are things that cause harm. So you want to avoid those things. And so I think that you want to, that's just as important what not to eat as what to eat. So for me, my rule for myself and my patients that are trying to do this as well as they can would be no plants or mushrooms, no sugar or any sweeteners, and nothing artificial. And that goes for sauces, seasonings, and drinks as well. And so you try to apply this and say, okay, well, what's this? Oh, that's spices, that's a plant. I mean, sometimes you use some plants, things like that, and that helps you, as a seasoning or a spice or something like that, that helps you or your patient get their head around this crazy idea of only eating meat, then that's fine. But I would encourage people to at least at some point try eliminating these things out for 30 days and just see how you feel. Some people are much more sensitive than others, especially specific ethnic backgrounds. So we've come to agriculture at different points in our human evolution, some 10,000 years ago, some 100 years ago, right? So the Inuit population really introduced to Western diet in the last 100 years, same with many people in the Great Plains of America and Native Australians. I have a patient who is of Inuit descent. She fed her daughter normal food. She was getting seizures as a baby. As soon as she was weaned, she was having epilepsy. And so she found that the only things that her daughter could tolerate was meat. And that was very traditionally appropriate to their culture. And they said, well, that's fine. We know meat's good, so they just ate meat. So they've been carnivores for the last 40 years. She has 4 autoimmune diseases. Why? Because she used seasonings, spices and seasonings. She came across me saying that, hey, look, maybe just try cutting out all of these things. That can't be. There's no way. But she did. She tried it for 30 days. All of her autoimmune issues are now gone. So she's much more sensitive, obviously, because of her ethnic background. But if you have a sticky situation with a patient, you're just not quite getting where you want to go with a ketogenic diet or a whole food diet approach, this is something to think about. So why are plants bad? Okay, a lot of people hear whole food practitioners, ketogenic practitioners. Well, if it's real food, then that should be really good for you. Yes and no. It's relatively good, right? So it's a lot better than the alternative, the highly processed junk food, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that they're perfectly safe and sound. I gave an entire lecture on this. I'm trying to boil down to one slide in 5 minutes that I gave it to a medical conference in Australia. And I titled it, Plants Are Trying to Kill You. And I try to make this argument to a room full of 300 ketogenic doctors about how they need to cut out the vegetables as well. And at first they were like, well, what the hell is this guy talking about? And by the end of it, I had white-haired professors of medicine going up to me and going, I never want to eat a damn vegetable again in my life. And I was like, Good. So food is species specific. This cannot be stressed more than in the plant kingdom. So plants are living organisms. They want to stay living organisms, and if you eat them, they die. And so they have defenses just like every other living thing has a defense, but they're stationary. They can't run away or fight back like an animal can, and so they have to have other means of defenses. The main mean of defense is chemical in nature, so they make 1 million different defensive chemicals in order to stop predation. And so certain animals have evolved the ability to break down specific poisons in specific plants. But if they go outside of that range of plants that they can eat, they can get very sick or they can even die. There's a whole field of this in veterinary medicine where they have different diseases: big head, big tongue, limp neck, crazy cow syndrome. These are all names of diseases, but they're actually from exposure to plants that they're not typically known to eat, and they get very sick from this. And so they know, okay, well, what do you do with an exposure? What do you do with a disease? You give it a pill. What do you do with an exposure? You get the hell away from it, right? So you have lead poisoning. You don't just take pills for that. You get the lead out of your environment. That's the number one thing that you do. And so you have to, as doctors, we need to understand that some of the diseases we're treating are actually exposures. And so we need to get our patients away from that exposure. And we see this in the animal kingdom as well. We actually see the other side of that: malnutrition, not getting the right things. So again, going back to livestock medicine, there's a condition called muscular dystrophy that people here may know of. Did you guys know that muscular dystrophy actually exists in cows? And it's the exact same presentation of disease as we see in the human population. But they figured it out. They actually call it nutritional muscular dystrophy, and that's because they found it's from a selenium deficiency. How many people have asked that question of, is our children with muscular dystrophy have a nutritional deficiency of some sort, selenium? Or no one checks selenium, right? So I guarantee you their pediatrician has never checked this. And so that's a question that has to be asked, especially when we're talking about kids being significantly hurt by something like muscular dystrophy. So diet is species specific. So that koala eats one plant. Pandas eat one plant. Those are pretty toxic plants to other animals. So not many other animals eat those things, but they don't eat anything else. And that's very important. So when we're talking about our diet, we need to understand which plants we can eat, which ones we can't eat. And the ones we've been exposed to the longest are the ones that we can probably do okay with. People that have only been exposed to these things for 100 years should probably stay away. People exposed to it for 10,000 years, maybe. But what were we eating 10,000 years ago? Generally not the same things we're eating now. What were we eating 50,000 years ago? There isn't a plant around at the grocery store that even existed 50,000 years ago. We've hybridized these things. We've changed these things either genetically or through modification and breeding. So what we've been exposed to the longest is the immutable law of biology, the immutable law of adaptation. What you've been exposed to the longest is what is more appropriate for you. We've only come to plants very recently, and the plants that we're eating now, even more recently than that, and processed food, not at all. So we don't have very good tolerances towards these things. We have great tolerance towards meat. So some of these things are directly toxic. The bottom right picture there is hemlock. North American water hemlock. That's the most dangerous plant in North America. Half a leaf can kill an adult, give you intractable seizures, bind to your GABA receptors, and you will get intractable seizures and die within a minute or two, and you can't reverse that. That's how they killed Socrates, with hemlock. And so there can be directly toxic, but there can be other sorts of things. Cyanide can be directly toxic to you as well. Things like almonds have it, sweet almonds. It's lower amounts, but you get a couple pounds in you. Not many people eat several pounds of almonds. However, we are talking about things that sublethal exposures long-term can cause harm, can cause thyroid dysfunction, neurological dysfunction as well. They directly damage your mitochondria and the oxygen transport chain, electron transport chain in development of ATP. Cassava, that's a staple root of 750 million people. That's the number one calorie source of 750 million people in the tropics. So that's a major, major food source. There's bitter cassava and sweet cassava. Bitter cassava will kill you, and people do die from this. But again, so I have to treat it properly. But again, low-grade exposure to cyanide causes long-term harm, and we are calling these things diseases. Oh, we don't know why this person's thyroid is bad. Oh, they're having some sort of weird neurological symptom. Isn't that strange? Let's put them on some medicine. See if that helps. Not understanding what is causing the problem in the first place. There's a thing called veggie chips in Australia, and they're made with cassava, and they have tapioca powder, which is more cyanide, powdered cyanide. And it was actually, I had a patient who came in and she had gotten very sick. She'd been doing carnivore for 6 months, felt very good, had a handful of these veggie chips at a party, and just absolutely felt awful. She had to sit down in the car. She was sweating. She couldn't speak. It took her half an hour to recover, to tell her husband, hey, we need to go. I really don't feel well. Next day, still felt unwell. Looked it up and like, what the hell is in these veggie chips? And she found there was cassava and tapioca, and she looked it up and said, is anybody else in Australia getting sick from these things? And he found, actually, yeah, there were several reports of people getting sick because there was a higher than normal cyanide load in that batch of veggie chips. They don't say that on the bag. Like, why the hell don't they, right? It's something that the WHO and the CDC regularly says, hey, look, there's no safe amount of cyanide that you can get, maximum 10 sort of milligrams a day in an adult. 50 milligrams could kill you. 0.5 milligrams per kilogram can kill you. So a 100 kilo person, 50 milligrams can kill you. Well, it's a range though, 0.5 to 3.5. But as little as that could do that. And there's quite a lot in here. A serving of flaxseed can have 6 milligrams of cyanide in it, right? So we're giving this stuff to kids. And we're not even knowing that this has these harmful ingredients in it that they don't put on the bag. The WHO and the CDC say, hey, you really shouldn't be eating any of this stuff. Nowhere does that show up on these foodstuffs. Hormone disruptors, soy, flaxseed, our friend flaxseed, again, they have phytoestrogens. They can either block the estrogen receptors or mimic estrogen. And there's other sort of hormonal disruptors as well. There are case reports of men growing breast, getting gynecomastia for drinking 8 glasses of soy milk a day, prolonged, and then they take away the soy milk and the gynecomastia recedes. And so there you go. If you drink soy milk, 8 glasses a day is enough estrogen to grow breasts in a man. Nutrient blockers. There are a lot of these sorts of things. The anti-nutrients people talk about, phytic acid, oxalates, these sorts of things. They'll bind to different nutrients and actually make them less bioavailable, so you can't absorb them. So we see, wow, there's all these nutrients in here. That's great. We put them through a mass spectrometer and say, wow, look at all that calcium. Then you give people spinach, which has a lot of calcium. This study was done in the 1950s, and they found the calcium levels actually went down because that calcium was bound up in ways that the body couldn't access, couldn't break those bonds. And then they came with oxalates that then went into the bloodstream and actually stripped out the person's calcium themselves. So what you're eating on paper may not actually be what you're getting nutritionally. There are other nutrient blockers and disruptors, such as wheat and soy have protease inhibitors. So protease is an enzyme secreted from our pancreas, and that allows us to break down proteins and absorb the amino acids. But many plants, soy and protein being major ones, they block that process. So even if you're eating very bioavailable protein and meat, if you eat it with these nutrient disruptors, then you won't absorb all that you could have. Photosensitivity, there's a thing called furanocoumarins, all citrus. Parsnips, celery, many other plants have furanocoumarins that are light sensitive. UV light will hit them and they'll bind irreversibly to proteins and DNA, permanently damage them. And so you can actually get chemical burns. People that have been squeezing limes in the sun, this is in the published literature. So in dermatology, I don't know if there's any dermatologists in the room? Anyone? No? Not really? Okay. Anyway, if you talk to a dermatologist, this is in dermatology. It's called phytophotodermatitis, right? So you're getting skin damage from some sort of plant toxin and sun exposure, this combination. And even a term for celery, it's celery dermatitis. I've spoken to farmers that grow celery and say, oh yeah, well that's well known. You have to have gloves, long sleeve shirts, everything, because if that sap touches your skin in the sun, you'll get horribly burned. You get horrible chemical burns from that. And then we eat this stuff. It goes in our body and we become more photosensitive. And we see this in animals as well. They get in the wrong sort of plants and they just get blistering wounds all over their body. Cyanogenic, we spoke about that. Gluten and lectins. Gluten is a lectin, and there's lectins in meat as well, but they don't seem to do anything to us. This is a class of defense chemical that can cause all sorts of harm. Ricin, some people may know, this is the most toxic substance that exists on Earth, and it is a lectin, and 1 milligram per kilogram will kill you, or pretty much any other animal on Earth. And these are defenses. These are generally around the beans, seeds, nuts, legumes. They're also in the nightshade family. So tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, peppers, very high in lectins as well. They can cause damage to the gut lining. They can cause leaky gut. They can get in your body. And this is something that has been attributed to autoimmunity. And there are studies showing this relationship between lectins in your body. Our body's making antibodies towards that. We're getting cross-reactivity in the rest of our body, which is something we'll come to on why a carnivore diet on top of a ketogenic diet, a ketogenic carnivore diet, is actually very important for autoimmunity, especially because you're getting rid of all of these plants that your body could be making antibodies towards. So evolutionarily, this does make sense. This is a biologically appropriate diet, a proper human diet. We see here where the cranial capacity is growing. We're eating more and more meat during this time period. And then all of a sudden, right here with the advent of the ice ages, and basically we're forced to become apex predators or we die, and most other early humans did die. All of a sudden, bam, this exponential growth in cranial capacity up until right around agriculture, and then sharp decline down. So immediately after agriculture, we see a sharp decline in the height, health, and development of early humans. And you can see it right here. So this is, it doesn't have the bottom part of it, unfortunately, but this is out of a textbook on paleoanthropology. And this is pre-agricultural man. Here on the left, this is post-agriculture. This is immediately after agriculture. Immediately before and after agriculture. This does not take hundreds of years. This did not take thousands of years. This was overnight. We see the height and health of the population has declined. And this happened at any time in any location with any food crop that they went to. So every example of agriculture, be it in Samaria, be it in Mesoamerica, be it elsewhere, they found the exact same disparities in the drop in height. Usually dropped around 4 or 5 inches. Jaws became smaller, teeth became more crowded and crooked, had more dental caries, signs of poor nutrition, shorter femurs. Tuberculosis started showing up in the fossil record for the first time up and down the spine. And so everywhere you saw, the height and health of the people declined, and their brains declined. 11% for men on average, 17% on average for women. That's persisted until today. We also see this disparity in the modern era. We saw the same disparity with the Native Americans in the Great Plains who were just eating bison. There's a study in 2001 that showed that they were the tallest population of human beings alive on Earth at the time. And then they switched over to a more agrarian lifestyle because we wiped out the bison, unfortunately. And what happened? Exactly the same thing. They shrank, they got sick. Now they have a far higher disease rate in America. We see this in the Inuit population. You can see steadily the cancer rates are going up, heart disease rates are going up as they're being more involved in a Western society. As anthropologists talk about this difference in the diseases and issues that people contend with, going from a primitive lifestyle to a more civilized lifestyle. They can deal with injury, they deal with infections. That's the major issues of their societies. And then when they go into civilization, they deal with these chronic diseases. Why is that? They're actually living similar amounts of time. It's not that they're just not living long enough. That's not true. It's that they're getting different exposures. And so again, this is not a disease. This is an exposure relationship. And we see that in the Maasai versus Akikuyu. These are two tribes that live in the same area. They're alive at the same time, in the same area, the same conditions. They eat a very different diet. So the Maasai eat animal-based diet. They eat a lot of dairy, raw dairy, blood from their cattle, meat from their cattle, or things that they hunt as well. And they're extremely strong and healthy. The Akikuyu, largely plant-based. You guys, the British, did a large study in the 1920s, over several years, published in 1931, I believe, that looked at the differences between these two populations because it was a very good example of observation. Okay, these people are largely the same. They interbreed. They've been interbreeding for centuries, so maybe even longer. And so genetically similar, alive at the same time, same area, same conditions, just a very different diet, and that's pretty much it. And the disparities were nearly identical to what you see here between these two. The Maasai men were on average 5 inches taller, 23 pounds heavier of lean body mass, 50% stronger, and they had almost no diseases, no chronic diseases, no infectious disease, a very low rate. They went to the hospitals, they got the official records, they went to clinics, and then because a lot of these people were living remotely, they went from village to village to village to village to village. And they did their own medical assessments as well of both the Akikuyu and the Maasai. And they found massive disparities in their health. They found the Akikuyu were very sick. They were getting a lot of infectious disease. They're getting a lot of chronic diseases. They had a lot of nutritional deficiencies. So they said, okay, well, let's correct those nutritional deficiencies they had in a prison population. So they were controlled in a matter of speaking. And so they gave them nutritional supplements. Did not improve their health. Did not improve their infection rate. Did not improve these sorts of diseases. It wasn't until they removed the plants and added in meat to their diet that they started to improve. So there's something they're missing from meat, and there's something that's harming them in plants. So on-the-ground experience, this is something that we can go through all the data, we can go through all the literature, we can go through all the thousands of studies on ketogenic diets, and a lot of people are on board with that, and that's fine, but at a certain point you have to say, okay, is this enough for me to apply this to my patient population? And for me, the answer was absolutely. And I saw it work very well firsthand for myself, for my family, for my patients, and then a growing body of patients, and now this basically my main practice is applying this to people and reversing these so-called irreversible diseases. Hashimoto's thyroiditis is an autoimmune disease. This is way more common than people realize because they don't check it until your thyroid is completely defunct and your TSH is well over 10, things like that. I check people more regularly. If something's off a little off, I want to know why it's off. I want to know, is it because you have cyanide in your diet, is it because you're not eating properly, or is it because you have Hashimoto's? I check, and I find way more of these cases before they become a disaster. There's a difference between retrospective medicine, cleaning up the disaster, and prospective medicine, preventative medicine, seeing, hey, how do we prevent a disaster? So we have hundreds of patients with Hashimoto's. Every single one that goes onto a carnivore diet, we measure their antibodies, they go right down. And eventually, if they stay on it, those antibodies will go to zero. As Hashimoto's is a bit stubborn. It can take actually quite some time for those antibodies to come down. I had one lady who's very strict, just red meat and water. Her antibodies were sort of 650 and 50. After 8 months, they were down to 50 and 0. So they came right down, but still has a bit of work to do, but going in the right direction. So every single one of these people that are able to continue a carnivore diet, especially a red meat and water diet, which is actually pretty important, we might be able to talk about that, about why that is, improves. And those antibodies will go to zero, and we see that for basically any other autoimmune disease as well. Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, lupus, all these sorts of things, Graves' disease. They all significantly improve, especially if going on just a red meat and water diet. I have patients who have been in wheelchairs with multiple sclerosis and had very serious burden of lesions on their MRIs, and now they're living normal lives. They're neurologically intact, and their lesions are resolving on MRI. So it's subjective improvement and objective improvements as well. And Crohn's disease, I mean, that just goes away. All these autoimmune issues go away. And so this is something that specifically, if you have a patient with autoimmunity, or if you suffer from autoimmunity yourself, the carnivore diet, specifically a meat-only diet, getting rid of the plants, is a massive, massive game changer for your life and the life of your patients. This would make a massive difference on top of a ketogenic diet approach. And this is actually in the literature. We have this for Crohn's disease. We have randomized controlled trials looking at an elemental diet as a treatment modality for Crohn's disease. Elemental diet is actually quite a processed diet. It's basically scoop protein diet, just the macros, just the micros that you need, nothing else, right? So just the nutrients you need and nothing else. That's what a steak is. It's just the nutrition that you want, right? So they did this with an elemental diet. And it's generally ketogenic as well, because they first developed the elemental diet for children with epilepsy. And we know 100 years of evidence on ketogenic diets being helpful. It was the only treatment for epilepsy for many decades before we had pharmaceutical interventions. So when you put a Crohn's disease patient on an elemental diet, that is a better treatment for an acute flare-up of Crohn's than prednisone, steroids. So just not eating certain things is a better treatment than steroids, the gold standard, and completely suppress the immune system, right? So that should tell you something. Just eat the right thing, and you won't have this disease. It's an exposure. There was another study, again with Crohn's. They eliminated carbohydrates and fiber. Can you think of many plants that don't have carbohydrates or fiber? When you get rid of carbohydrates and fiber, like, what's left? Not much, right? So you're basically just eating meat or some processed crap. I don't know. But none of that stuff anyway. So when they did that, they tried to see how long they could keep people in remission without medication. Up to 51 months by just removing carbohydrates and fiber. And then contrast that with a controlled group that didn't eliminate either of these. They stayed in remission without medication on average 0 months. So not a lot of months. So big contrast. So just not eating carbohydrates and fiber was quite a good treatment for this, right? Because you're removing an exposure. It's a cause and effect relationship. You bring that back in and all of a sudden the problem comes back. So that's cause and effect. And so there's something, so the carbohydrates, the fiber, or something that comes along with the carbohydrates and the fiber, or a combination of the above, is causing the disease, right? Cancer. I mean, ketogenic metabolic therapy for cancer is sort of a hot new research direction, which is very interesting to me personally, especially in the field of GBM, glioblastoma. And so that's something that we are seeing more and more and more people take upon themselves. And I've seen quite a few patients significantly improve their outcome. And some people actually decided to go outside of standard of care because they have a GBM. It's a very serious diagnosis and very poor prognosis. And they say, okay, well, I don't accept that. I don't accept a 3-month timeline. I'm going to try something else. And actually, people are having quite amazing results with that. And there are case series, large case series from Cedars-Sinai, from other groups in Arizona. There are randomized controlled trials, about 24 just with GBM. And, but they're smaller, maybe 20 patients, things like that. But we're seeing recessions. We're seeing these GBMs, which you have a 3-month average survival from diagnosis without treatment. These things are receding and they're shrinking. People have fourth-line therapy. They're getting resections, they're getting chemo, they're getting radiation, they're getting re-resections, they're getting another dose of radiation, they're getting another resection, they're going on the last stage sort of chemotherapy called Avastin, which is basically hands-off. You can't touch them after that. You operate on them, they'll just bleed out. You can't touch them after that. And after that, they say, well, everything's going in the wrong way. You could just try not eating carbs, right? And it works. And so Cedars-Sinai published a case series with 16 patients, and some of these people had this sort of fourth-line treatment where they're having aggressive. It's an aggressive disease. It just is. It is instantly terminal. You get that diagnosis, you have a terminal disease. It is considered non-curable, and so all of a sudden, instead of growing, now it's shrinking again. Every single person in that case series was still alive at the time of publication, and they all had remained on the diet. 2 people did not remain on the diet, and they did not survive. One person had been a vegetarian prior to that, and so that was a big difference for him going on to a high-fat, meat-based ketogenic diet. And at first he was doing great. He was able to return neurological function. He was able to go out with his friends and get sort of a more normal life. And then he said, this is not really working for me on a lifestyle point of view. So he went back to his old other sort of way of eating. He actually died within the year, which is actually quite sad. Hemochromatosis. This is something that people say, well, avoid meat. So I've done the wrap it up call. Hemochromatosis is something that people say you don't eat red meat because it has all this bioavailable nutrients. It's too much. You don't want that. I actually see the opposite. I see people actually improve their metabolism of iron. Again, anecdotal, but we're seeing this. Testosterone. Every guy that's coming to my clinic, bar one, has had a significant improvement in their testosterone going on a carnivore diet. Again, this is ketogenic, but you're also getting away from the hormonal disruptors. PCOS, hormonal issues for women. High insulin blocks the conversion of testosterone into estrogen at the level of the ovaries, and so you get too much testosterone, too little estrogen, and you get PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and many other issues. I've even seen women in their 50s, and I know Dr. Berry has had this experience too, women coming out of menopause in their 50s, and you have to warn them, like, hey, you could get pregnant, so just be careful. And that freaks people out, but that's why you warn them. Ehlers-Danlos. I have 3 patients that I see personally, and I've spoken to others that have done online consultations with them. Who knew this was going to get better? Put them on a carnivore diet. All of a sudden, they don't have joint dislocations anymore. That's crazy. And then they start eating crap again, and they'll start having dislocations within the week. Very interesting. I don't know why that is. I have a couple theories, but we see that anyway. Insulin resistance, literally hundreds of patients. I do check for insulin, fasting insulin. I check for different markers to look for insulin resistance. It is very prevalent. And so when I put people on these diets, it just reduces down very significantly. You know, you want to be below 10, really. Lower than 10 is better, but at least below 10. I had a guy came in January, his fasting insulin was 72, right? And so the problem with insulin is not just, you know, that your blood sugar is out of control. Insulin affects over 100 different processes in your body that are very significant. And so if it's down below 10, it's affecting everything below 10. But if you eat pasta and it jumps up to 35, it's affecting everything at 35, and that's out of balance. And now you get insulin resistance and you're up at 72 all the time, then you eat, it goes up to 102, who knows? And that's obviously much worse. So within 6 weeks on a carnivore diet, that was already down to 35. It's a massive, massive improvement that we see in people. And obesity. Sometimes we actually, there are studies that actually see that lectins can bind to insulin receptors 5 times as tightly as insulin itself. And so even on a ketogenic diet where your insulin is down, you can still get an insulin sort of response. You can affect all those 100+ physiological mechanisms in your body that insulin affects by the lectins as well. So that's something that can actually absolutely improve. And we see a very, very, we have very high success rate treating obesity, and basically everyone who stays on the diet. And because it's a lifestyle, it's a proper diet, more people are able to stick with that as well and think that this is a lifestyle now. So we have very good success. So in summary, there's growing anecdotal and self-reported evidence that carnivore diet solves some health issues that other people simply don't. The next stage, we need more further experimental studies, just like Dave Feldman said. You can have 5 million people all getting better. It's anecdotal. I'm like, all right, I'm still going to do it. And so, but the next stage is try to do these prospective or experimental studies to build on the body of the ketogenic diet and identify further benefits of a carnivorous ketogenic diet. Because the thing is, we need to remember that, again, in that Venn diagram, a carnivore diet is a ketogenic diet. Those ketogenic diets, you get rid of carbohydrates. What do you replace it with? Fat and protein. Where do you get that from? You get that from meat, generally. You could do that on a plant-based diet, but none of the studies do. This body of knowledge of studies that we have they use meat. It's a high-fat, meat-based diet. They might use some coconut oil and other sorts of things as well, but predominantly they're replacing that with high-fat meat. And so these are high-fat, meat-based diets, and that's what a carnivore diet is. So it actually is quite a lot of robust studies to support this, and we need to build on that, obviously. So in the meantime, this is a real food diet. It doesn't pose any harm. There's nothing bad in meat. Saturated fat is good for you. It's not bad for you. Cholesterol is supposed to be there. It's not supposed to not be there. All your hormones are made out of cholesterol. Your brain's made out of cholesterol. Your axons are myelinated with cholesterol and saturated fat. And every single cell in your body, the cell membrane, is largely made of this lipid bilayer of cholesterol molecules. Very good stuff. So there's nothing in there that's going to harm you. And so if you are having trouble with your patients, and you're seeing one of these chronic diseases that just don't go away, or you have them yourself, give it a try. See what happens. And if that helps your patient, great. It doesn't matter what studies say. Studies are there to guide us and allow us to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do in my life, or this is what I'm going to do in my practice. This is how I'm going to help people. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is that N of 1, is that anecdote. Does that help your patient? Does that help you? So you just try, okay, I have these studies, I have this information that has pointed me in this direction, I'm going to give it a try. And look at that, I don't have lupus anymore. Okay, I'm not going to, well, if you don't want to do that, because that's going to make things worse. Yeah, but it didn't, So that's the important thing. That's the most important part of that. So public are going ahead. A lot of people are saying, look, I'm going to try this. This is helping me, so I'm going to do it. But now we need more clinicians to understand that this is a medical intervention, and this is something that is one of the most powerful tools that you can have in your arsenal to treat very serious diseases and get people off medication and get them better, which I think is everyone's goal. I don't think anybody here, any clinicians here are like, oh, I just can't wait to just prescribe meds or anything like that and watch your patient population slowly die and get worse. It's just depressing. This is something you can make them better. And so that's something that I just want to encourage other clinicians to just keep that in mind. That's something that you can do and potentially help your patients. So thank you very much.
We now need to dive into this topic, and I've got 101 questions, of which I want to dive into, including questions that I'm sure either people here or people watching at home or people that will watch will be desperate to ask and perhaps challenge. But maybe to start off, Trudi, what's your thoughts on, as a dietitian, on meat only and the concerns people will have around what they're not getting?
Well, I have prepared, in the last 24 hours, I have prepared 20 questions, so we'll see if we've got time for them. But I'd like to say, first of all, I am an evidence-based dietitian, and so I'm not a naysayer, and I have been keto myself for 10 years. I have read The Plant Paradox by, is it Steve Grundy? And I understand that some people may have problems with plants, but for myself, personally, I would miss vegetables and salads with my meat. So I think that's from a personal perspective. And also, through when people come are referred to us for diabetes structured education, our philosophy is develop the knowledge, the understanding, and the confidence for people to make self-informed decisions about the dietary approach and how they would like to self-manage their diabetes. And one thing that they learn through our programs is that one size doesn't fit all, and we're there to help support them, helping to achieve their goals, whatever decision they make. So if people came up to me and said, Trudi, I would like to try the carnivore diet, I would certainly say, okay, then how can I support you in doing that? So interestingly, when this session was confirmed on Thursday evening, I thought, I will go out. We've got 42 patient and public involvement representatives, which is a bit like public involvement at the GP practice side, the patient participation groups. And so I did a very quick e-shot to these 42 individuals, and I asked them 4 questions. I provided a very brief overview of what the carnivore diet was. And then I asked them 4 questions. 1, have you heard of the carnivore diet? 2, have you tried it at all, or do you know somebody who's tried it? 3, if so, what were the positives and what were the negatives? And then number 4, would you have any concerns about going on the carnivore diet? So in 24 hours, I was really impressed. I got 25 responses. 79% of them had never heard of the carnivore diet. And these are all expert graduates who have been on the program. They'd never heard of the carnivore diet. They'd all recognised that type 2 diabetes was a carbohydrate intolerance condition. They'd all restricted the carbohydrate intake to some extent. They were no longer fearful about eating and consuming healthy fats, and they'd all increased their protein content by some extent. But they'd never heard of the carnivore diet, which I thought was really interesting. So they hadn't been on it themselves. They didn't know anybody who had been on it. So they couldn't report any positives or negatives. 50% of them, the concern is that they'd be missing nutrients from vitamins and minerals and fibre. So 50% of them, so 12, 13 of them reported that they'd be really concerned that they'd be nutrient deficient in vitamins, minerals and fibre. Only 2 of them thought they'd be constipated. A few of them were concerned about the cost of the carnivore diet. There was one concern about red meat and cancer. There was a few ethical considerations, and I know this debate today isn't around the ethics of the carnivore diet. But the majority of them said, I like my veggies and salads, so I would really miss those if I didn't have them in my diet. So before we go on to my questions, that was just, some public's perspective on the carnivore diet. Hope that's useful.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. That's excellent. Thanks, Trudi. Ken, have you any thoughts on, when we're thinking about the continuum between real food through to carnivore, any thoughts on how you might identify who a carnivore diet might be better suited to?
Yeah, I love the Venn diagram. I've often described it that way, and I've taken to calling it a proper human diet spectrum, because I think some people who are very young and metabolically resilient can eat a low-carb diet of real food, under 100 total grams a day and could do brilliantly, could do great. And we see that in practice. Some people who are a little older, a little more metabolically ill, need to think of it as a knob. Turn down your carbohydrate intake, right? And you just keep turning it down until you get your best health. And that's where you fall on the proper human diet spectrum. Some people need very low carb. Some people need ketogenic. My wife Nisha with Hashimoto's, as long as she's ketovore, 10 total grams of plant foods, any more than that and her numbers start to go up. 10 or less, if she sticks to that, her antibodies come down, her symptoms are in complete remission. And so that's her tolerance level for the plant, the phytonutrients, aka phytochemicals, aka phytotoxins. You can call them whichever, it's all interchangeable. And then some people like me, I tend to fatten very easily. I develop type 2 diabetes very easily. And for me, it's all about the carbohydrates. It's not the inflammation or the autoimmune issues, it's just the carbs. If I get above, I try to stay zero carb. And this is what you get when I do that. If I start to turn up the carbohydrate intake knob, I'll start to gain fat immediately. My A1C will start to go up. I'm just predestined to be a fat type 2 diabetic doctor. Isn't that attractive? That's what I'm predestined, my genetics say. And so I have to stay as close to zero carb. And I think that has a lot to do with my genetics. I've got a lot of northern DNA. Right? Scotch, Irish, Nordic, a lot of Neanderthal DNA. And so I need to be a meat eater because that's where my people came from and lived for the majority of the time. Is that true for people whose ancestors were at the equator for the last 25,000 years? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they can tolerate more. But I think there's a spectrum. Nobody needs more than 100 total grams of carbs a day. And so, does that answer your question, or do I need to tighten that up?
No, that's excellent. This is
drawing But I think that spectrum should be called a proper human diet, because when you approach someone and you say, "Oh, you need to eat a ketogenic diet," that's kind of weird, right? You say you need to eat a carnivore diet, that's weird as hell, right? But if you say you need a proper human diet and we need to find out where on that spectrum you fall, that sounds like something a dietitian could get behind, right?
Excellent, thanks, Ken. Anthony, I've always found in my GP work that being able to provide a patient with confidence that something's likely to work and make a difference makes a massive difference to whether or not they will follow through with it, and that plays a big role. With your experience and linking to maybe some of what we just heard around the autoimmune conditions, if this was a first meeting with a patient with pick any of those autoimmune conditions, how confident could you be that if you suggested and then they undertook a carnivore diet that they will see improvement?
Well, so with autoimmunity in general, I have yet to see an autoimmune condition that doesn't respond extraordinarily well to a meat-only diet. I've yet to see one that doesn't do even better on just a red meat and water diet. I just haven't seen that. And so I preface that. If it's Crohn's, I say you will not have Crohn's in a month if you just stop eating plants. If you just eat red meat and water only, this will be gone. Your symptoms will be largely gone within 3 to 4 weeks. In 3 months, you'll have a negative biopsy, maximum 3 months. I've never seen someone with a positive biopsy with Crohn's after 3 months on a red meat and water diet only, never. And so I can say that with very, very great assurity. Other sorts of things, you see weird, wild, wonderful autoimmune issues sometimes. And I say, well, I haven't seen that one before. I haven't seen someone try that, but every other autoimmune issue that I've ever seen responds this way. And they try it, and so far, batting 1,000 here. And so that's something that I can speak with confidently. And then it's great when you have them in your clinic, because you can say, okay, well, it's going to send you off with a whole panel of bloods. And you can go through all their blood work and say, look, this is because you're eating carbs, this is because you're insulin resistance, this is because of this, this is because of this, this is because of this, this is because you're eating these plants, these are because of these hormone disruptors, this is because of all these different sorts of things. And your symptoms and your autoimmune issues, those will go away if you stop eating plants. And this is how your numbers, this is how your numbers will change, and this is how your condition will change, your symptoms change. And you speak to that, and it's like, I know that because I have hundreds of patients who have done the exact same thing. And they say, okay, I'll give it a try. And 2 months later, you check their blood, they have the exact same improvements that I said they were gonna have. Their symptoms are completely, sometimes gone, or at least significantly improved. And they just say, okay, all the changes that you said were going to happen happened. All the changes on my blood report basically happened. And so, okay, I'm in, I'm sold. And so it's you're having that blood work in front of them, being able to point down to what they're eating, causing these sorts of discrepancies in the blood work is very powerful as a motivator. And then seeing that change in just a couple months makes a massive, massive difference for them. And then they see, it's not just, well, I feel better, but what are my bloods? One of your bloods are getting a lot better. And they got better in the exact ways that we said they would. And so they say, okay, this is working, this makes sense, this makes biological sense, physiological sense. And they're pretty sold by that point.
So hugely confident. Hugely confident.
Yeah.
And when we think about red meat and I guess and longevity, what you've just described is the potential rapid gains people will see in their health in a very, very short 1 to 2 months. Is almost why don't you give it a go?
Yeah.
That's that sell with it. But then I guess one of the challenges or worries that people might have is, yes, but how about the long term? Mm-hmm. Trudi, do you want to fire some questions about somebody's got healthier, they're doing a carnivore diet, their life's changed, but they're worried because we have studies or reports or media articles that may make them worry about their health in the longer run?
Yes, every day is a school day. And so if I don't learn something new every day, it's a day wasted. So hopefully I'm going to learn lots of new things here. So question number 1 is, what about the gut microbiota? So we're informed that there's a strong connection between healthy bacteria in our gut and brain health and also a good immune system. And Tim Spector and the Zoe program, which you may be aware of, they inform us that we should be having around 30 different plants every week, and then these plants should be nice and colourful, and that's really been taken on in the UK. So do you have any research evidence that when people go on a carnivore diet that their gut microbiota remains healthy? What do you have to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, just first as a tangent on you want to eat a whole bunch of different colors. I mean, what nutrient is green? I mean, what are we getting out of that? Oh, we need that green one. I mean, what the hell is that going to be? It says, oh, I'm feeling really low on purple. I need to go get some purple. You know, I mean, it's just sort of, it's just, so I think that's a bit of I mean, it's a recommendation, and unless you analyze that and sort of scratch at it, it's, oh, okay, this is what you do. And it's like, yeah, but that doesn't make sense. Like, why would we follow that advice? As far as the microbiome is concerned, this argument that you have to have fiber in order to have healthy microbiome, what is that based on? It's based on studies that look at 2 populations, one that don't eat much fiber, one that eats more fiber, and they have a healthier microbiome. What are those populations? Well, me and Ken, and then all the people eating processed crap. Right? So there aren't as many of us carnivores that are actually eating a proper human diet that are involved in these studies in the non-fiber arm of that. So they're looking at people eating a highly processed garbage diet that does not have fiber in it, and they're saying eating a more whole food, real food approach with some fiber in it, and they're saying, oh, that's better, must be the fiber. Is it the fiber though? Or is it because they've really cleaned up their diet in a lot of ways? And then we see data on the Inuit, who traditionally just only eat meat. They have some of the healthiest microbiomes that have ever been studied. Very good biodiversity and healthy makeup. And then I know that you've checked your microbiome as well?
Yeah, me and many people in the carnivore community have actually sent stool samples and had our microbiome. And most of the microbiome testing companies also sell a line of supplements. Shocker, right? Yeah, and so all of us, without exception, I know Siobhan Huggins sent a sample, I did, many of us, did you, Dave? A lot of us have. And our microbiome comes back very diverse, very healthy, all beautiful. But we need some of those supplements. So that But I've yet to see a carnivore stool sample for microbiome come back somehow crippled or somehow not good. I just don't see that. And I think that just the entire concept of you've got to have phytonutrients, you've got to have all the colors, you've got to have fiber to feed your gut microbiome. We have so many examples in archaeology and anthropology of people who ate no plants whatsoever, and they didn't die. And so right off the bat, I think just foundationally, just as a logical argument, not even getting into the biology, it's like there are multiple examples that disprove that. Why would you even entertain that as a theory, right off the bat. But then most of the studies of microbiome would compare a subset eating just highly processed junk versus a more whole foods, unprocessed, and they would say, oh, their microbiome improved. And I would say that's got nothing to do with the increased fiber. That's got to do with they moved on to Dr. Chaffee's Venn diagram of eating real food. Mm-hmm. And so I think once we have head-to-head comparison of carnivore gut microbiomes versus any other patient subpopulation, I think this argument will quickly die because it'll be proven foolish.
Yeah.
One of the thoughts I had is that we know they talk about the short-chain fatty acids, so the fibre breaks down to short-chain fatty acids, but we all know we can get short-chain fatty acids from full-fat dairy. So do they perform the same in the gut? That's just a question I've got, so I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that.
So another interesting thing about that, you're supposed to eat lots of fiber so that your large intestine microbes can break that down into short-chain fatty acids. Well, what happens to those short-chain fatty acids? Do they go back into the circulation and nourish the entire body? No. They only perhaps nourish the enterocytes, the actual cuboidal epithelial cells lining the gut. Well, guess how else the gut cells could get short-chain fatty acids? Just eat fatty meat and fatty dairy. You don't need the bacteria. And actually, some people in the carnivore community consider feeding the bacteria in your gut probably not a good idea. Because, we don't feed the bacteria on our skin. We don't want to feed the bacteria on our countertop. Why would we want to feed the bacteria? And so I'm still deciding on that, but that's kind of compelling, right? You're like, yeah, why is that the only bacteria that we want to coddle? Is that bacteria? I don't know. But I think that we need a head-to-head study of 50 carnivores and 50 people eating a whole food plant-based diet and look at the microbiome, look at the short-chain fatty acids. The short-chain fatty acids do not make it back in the general circulation. They don't help the human body in any way. They perhaps feed the enterocytes, and that's it.
Yeah.
Just a point to pull out of clarity there. You're not aware of any published studies on the microbiome of a large group of carnivores? I'm just thinking through the general member of the public, their response might be, what about the microbiome? And you've clearly got some first-hand experience. Are there any studies published, or is that just a missing piece of
data? I think we probably need to get a case series together, Doctor, maybe that might interest you. And I think we need to get that published pretty quickly because the gut microbiome of carnivores is gorgeous. It's a rainbow of bacteria in there for carnivores.
I was just going to say as well, though, we do have those studies with carnivorous Inuit. I mean, that's already published. They have exceptionally diverse and healthy microbiomes. That's in the literature. I haven't had them on my podcast yet, but I've sort of been in peripheral touch with people that study the microbiome specifically, and they actually are big fans of the carnivore diet specifically because it gives such a healthy microbiome. And that's something that people, we're worried about microbiome. And they're saying, no, that's what you want for a healthy microbiome. Getting these short-chain fatty acids, you get butyrate butyric acid. These are the major ketone bodies that we make in a ketogenic state. That's exactly what they're sort of developing by having the breakdown of the fiber in your gut. And the thing is that whether or not those enterocytes prefer ketones, they can run on glucose because there are plenty of people eating a processed food diet with no real fat in it. They're not in ketosis, they're not making any ketone bodies, and they're not eating fiber, and yet they have intestines. They don't just rot out and fall out, right? So, just like your brain primarily runs on ketones, and why do I say that? When you have ketones available and you have glucose available, the cortex of your brain, 2/3 of your brain, will only run on ketones. So that's a preference. There's plenty of glucose available. It will only run on those ketones. So that's a preference. But when that ketones level comes down, it will fill in the gaps with the glucose. So it can run on both, and so can your intestine. So can your heart. Your heart prefers ketones as well. So your tissues can run on either glucose or ketones. Except for cancer. Cancers can't run on ketones, and that's like ketogenic metabolic therapy is a targeted approach at cancer metabolism. But just because we don't have fiber, so we're not having these short-chain fatty acids, so they're getting glucose in the circulation, right? So they're still alive. And if you're in ketosis, you will absolutely have their preferred ketone energy source.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe following on for the cancer questions, another common challenge that may appear, or a worry that might be in somebody's mind, is what about bowel cancer? Mm-hmm. So the kind of studies that get published, or at least they get promoted in the media, of red meat being linked to bowel cancer. Mm-hmm. We must explore this.
Yeah, well, so I mean that comes from a WHO diktat saying that this is the case, but it's processed meat, right? Okay, but processed meat is a process. It's not the meat itself. Something added to the meat. And say, well, meat's not cancerous, but processed meat is cancerous. And I was like, okay, well, it's not the meat then, is it? It's something you did to the meat, right? So you're blaming the meat because it's in the name, processed meat. But it's the process. There's something you've added to that. But also, it was fraud, just plain and simple. There was I forget the gentleman's name, but he was on the panel of the WHO. And not everybody at WHO is a crook, but and this guy was one of them. And so he said that being on that panel was the most difficult thing he's ever been involved with in his professional career, because he said he saw them throw out hundreds of high-quality, high-level studies that showed absolutely no connection or correlation between meat, even processed meat, and certainly not unprocessed red meat, and any form of cancer or any deleterious health outcomes. In favor of about 30 out of over 800 studies, they narrowed it down to about 30. They cherry-picked these things that were very poor quality, very junk studies that conflated processed food items that may contain meat as an ingredient or a topping, and called that meat. So pizza was meat, fast food was meat, lasagna was meat, these sorts of things, sandwiches, all sandwiches, that's just meat, right? So you're getting a Big Mac extra value meal. It's got, a 20-gram piece of meat in it, right? It's got all these 3 buns on a Big Mac, and a bunch of lettuce and nightshades and sugary seed oils, and you're getting nightshades deep fried in trans fats and a big sugary drink. And we're saying, they stopped, that meat's so bad for you. It's just like, you have to be a special kind of stupid to think that, right? Or a crook, and in this case, they were crooks. And so this gentleman actually challenged them and said, hey, listen, all of you guys are all vegans, vegetarians, or Seventh-day Adventists who are religiously anti-meat. You need to declare your bias. You need to say that this is where you're coming from, and they refused. And so that's why we don't know that. But he came out publicly and said that. The University of Washington in Seattle 2 years ago published a massive work. They looked at over 800 of these studies. And they found these studies, and they called them junk studies, lazy science, and they were garbage. And they said these are absolutely not showing anything. And there's like an 18, even then, even with calling pizza and fast food meat, they still only had an 18% increased correlation. When you're looking at epidemiology, that's background noise. It's not over 200% increased signal. It's just background noise, right? So they said, 100% causes cancer. And it's just marketing, right? And so, which is why I think it's great, we call this a proper human diet, because that's the same thing. We need to frame this properly. We need to frame a carnivore diet as a ketogenic diet. We have thousands of studies on ketogenic diets, and that's what this is. And this is a biologically appropriate, species-specific, proper human diet. And that's what we need to start thinking about this as. And that's what they did. So you fight fire with fire. They're trying to brand this in one way. We need to brand it in the proper way. And so the University of Washington showed that there's absolutely no, in the actual good studies, that don't conflate pizza with meat. And they didn't eliminate out confounding factors such as people that are eating more pizza and junk food are more likely to smoke, more likely to drink, more likely to do other sorts of things that could have a negative impact on their health. So they didn't correct for those things. They didn't account for them. And so you're going to get skewed results. And then the ones that did do that, no connection whatsoever between even processed meat and cancer, and especially not unprocessed red meat. That was the conclusion that University of Washington came to.
Yep.
Good confidence.
And let's be very clear on that. So let me sum that up. There is not a shred of controlled research in the literature that shows causation between red meat and increased risk of any cancer in human beings. And let's take up for bacon here and sausage okay? Even the research, there is no study that's controlled that shows a causation between highly processed meat and cancer of any type in human beings. That research does not exist, even though you've heard otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, and so making that statement saying that the WHO saying that this causes disease, I mean, there are no causative studies showing that. And even the epidemiological evidence says no, there's not even a correlation. And while epidemiological study association cannot show causation, so that 18% is definitely not showing causation, but if you can show that there is no association, no correlation, that actually proves there's no causation, because you have to have a correlation or an association if there's a cause and effect relationship. There will be one, by definition.
Thank you. Trudi?
Okay, the next question is, when people initially change their dietary approach, they're sometimes fearful of fat. So they may have more protein, but they're still a little bit cautious about increasing their fat intake. And that can take a few months, a few weeks or a few months for them to become more comfortable with having more fat. Now, we know that if people have an intake of protein up to 40 to 50% of their calories, that can cause protein poisoning, sickness and diarrhea. And back in 1881 with the Arctic expedition, then 19 out of the 25 explorers actually died due to this protein poisoning. And that was through cannibalism, because they were eating each other as they died, and they were very lean and didn't have a lot of fat. But my concern would be if people said, yes, carnivore, I've got an autoimmune condition, I want to go on carnivore, and initially that they were a little bit scared of increasing their fat intake. Would they be at risk of the protein poisoning?
Well, I mean, I just always frame it in the sense that they need the fat. Fat's an essential nutrient. It's not just a calorie source. It's essential fatty acids that you have to have or you can get sick and die. They're essential fat-soluble vitamins and nutrients that you have to have or you can get sick and die. So this is not just a calorie source. Oh my God, you're going to eat fat, you're going to get fat. That's actually not what we see. Gary Taubes had an excellent presentation this morning showing the exact opposite of that. And the medical consensus and treatment in the 1800s up through the early 1900s was you put people on a high-fat, meaty diet and you get rid of carbs and things like that. That's how you lose weight. Dr. Michael Eads had a great presentation where he sort of flipped things around, because he said, actually, you want to eat fat if you want to lose weight because it weighs less. You're getting more energy for less weight. And then we're talking about grams now. We weigh grams, right? Calories don't have calories are calories. That's not a gram. That's right. So it's calories per gram. It's a different unit. So calories are heat energy. And so it's 9 calories per gram of fat and 4 calories per gram of protein and carbohydrates. And protein, you have to sort of spend some energy to use it. So it's actually 3.4 calories of energy that you get out in the end of it. Flip that around. So we're worried about the grams. We're about how much we weigh. So it's 1 gram per 9 calories with fat. But it's 2.2 grams of carbohydrates for the same 9 calories, right? So you have to eat twice as much. You have to weigh twice as much, because we weigh grams. You put food in your mouth, it's not the calories that all of a sudden make your weight go up. It's the grams you just put in your mouth that weigh something. And protein actually turns out to be 3 grams per 9 calories. You have to eat 3 times as much mass and matter to get the same amount of energy. So if you're just on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, you will weigh less if more of those calories are from fat. And then when you frame it like these sorts of things and you reassure people and let them understand that saturated fat is not bad for you, it's very good for you. Cholesterol is extremely good for you. You're talking about people, you have some guy whose testosterone is in his boots, and you say, like, your testosterone is made out of cholesterol. You need this stuff. And they go, like, yeah, I'm going to get some cholesterol. So, yeah, no, that's how I try to frame it.
Just getting over that initial fear and helping people to understand that fat isn't bad for them.
Yeah, very important.
I think that's something that a dietitian, your patients, your clients come to you with so many preconceptions. Just a laundry list of preconceptions, and for many people, that's one. Saturated fat is bad, animal fat is bad. My mom taught me that, my grandmother taught me that, they said it on TV, it was on the box of Cheerios, so it must be true. But I think you do need to go out of your way to counsel that if you're going to try carnivore, it needs to be fatty carnivore, because otherwise people will try to live on skinless, boneless chicken breast. And I think for many people, when they go carnivore and they have that severe diarrhea, part of that is they're not eating enough fats, and they're getting just a touch of the protein poisoning you talked about, and one of the symptoms of that is diarrhea. And most people, when they start eating to satiety, don't eat small portions of high protein, low fat. Don't do that. Eat until you're full and make sure there's plenty of fat. All those symptoms get better. But I do think as a dietitian, that's something you should counsel people on, because half of them have a preconceived notion that saturated animal fat's bad. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say as well, I think it's so important to set down patterns of behavior as well. And if someone's saying, and there's people out there who say like, well, maybe when you're losing fat. I know Dr. Westman says this, and others as well. And, well, maybe you don't need to eat as much fat as you're losing fat. Okay, well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. I actually find I have better results with patients when they actually have a higher fat intake and actually can speed up their metabolism. Their body goes, oh, we're not in a famine. We don't need to slow down our metabolism. Their metabolism actually speeds up, and they actually lose more weight. But you're setting down a pattern of behavior. If someone's eating more lean meat early on, they're losing weight that way. Okay, at what point did they switch and eat more fat? But they're already used to eating lower fat, and you can have a problem then, like you just said. Even before you get protein poisoning, you're just not going to be as well because you're lacking in nutrients. And so now you've set down a pattern of behavior where you've been eating for the last 2 years, very lean meat diet, and you start having some problems. And so, oh, this damn carnivore diet, I knew this was going to get me, and then there's a problem with that. And I don't see that when people are just eating fatty. But if you start out with that, saying, okay, you just eat fatty meat until you're full, and then you stop and you go on with your life, then you can do that at any point. When you're losing weight, when you're gaining weight, it's the same thing. You just eat fatty meat until you're full, and that's it. And so you don't have to change something down the road. So it's like, my dad always get furious watching like football games, NFL football games, because like our teams would play brilliantly all the way through until the fourth quarter, and then we got to go prevent defense and just block out the long pass. And it's like, why would you do that? Why would you change the entire setup, your entire defensive structure, right when you've got to where you want to be? It's just like you don't switch horses mid-race. All these sorts of things that we talk about are illustrating that you want to have a pattern of behavior and a consistent pattern of behavior that you can learn. This become a lifestyle as opposed to a crash diet that you're just trying to, okay, fine, you just want to lose some weight and then go back to eating garbage, do whatever. But if you actually want to set down a pattern of behavior for the healthiest life that you can have in the long run, then that's what you need to do. And I think you start that from the beginning.
Excellent, thank you. Thinking back to clinical interaction, the tracking or biomarkers or blood tests, many people in the room, I guess, will be quite comfortable now with the kind of real food, low carb, or even keto diet with a patient that's got type 2 diabetes, and they kind of support them to change their diet, and then they know around about 2 to 3 months, you could check the lipids, check the glucose, check their waist circumference, and if everything's on track and everything's improving, you kind of got that confidence that let's continue this plan. Everything looks like it's going in the right direction, even if this may not be the kind of mainstream thinking still, we're confident that it's good for you. Is there any different with the carnivore diet compared to that approach? Say for your standard, of some patients, you suggest reducing carbohydrate and they just don't like veg. So I kind of say you can eat some of this protein stuff, and if you like the veg stuff, eat some of the veg stuff, and they kind of look at us like, if I have to eat the veg stuff, I'm not going to do this. So if they kind of say, well, I'll just do the meat stuff, is there anything else we should be looking out for other than those standard tests? Is there anything that carnivore throws up that's different?
Well, as far as testing is concerned, not too many. If you had a sort of thought on that.
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah.
That's helpful, because as clinicians, we're always worried about what's going to come around the corner that we don't know.
Yeah.
So
I think that it helps for clinicians to think of this as a subset of a ketogenic diet, which is a subset of a low-carb diet. So if you're a fan of Dr. Unwin and you believe in him and you trust him, he recommends a low-carb ketogenic diet. This is just a subset of that. It is Dr. Unwin approved. It is okay. All you're doing is turning down the carbohydrate intake knob even more. That's all. That's the only thing that's changing, is you're just cutting the carbs even lower. There's nothing weird or crazy about carnivore. Carnivore is just the complete absence of plants, right? Meat is part of a ketogenic diet. The end. right? Any rational ketogenic diet is going to have meat in it.
On that point, magnesium. So often we will see if people just do a very low carb or keto diet, they may get muscle cramps in the early days as the readjustments are going on in the body, and suggest magnesium supplementation to help with the muscle cramps and sometimes the constipation. What do we see on carnivore?
Well, when I check all my patients' magnesium, I typically see it go up. It can take months and months and months. Even with supplementation, it can take a while for people to go up. I do see it come up when people are on a carnivore diet, as well as zinc, vitamin D, B12, definitely B12. Everyone here is low on B12. I'll just tell you that right now. Unless you've been doing like a carnivore diet for a long time and using some liver and things like that. So people may not know this, but the reference ranges that we use are they're different at every single lab. Every single lab in London will have a different reference range for B12 and other sorts of things, because that's not what the optimal reference range is. That's the average for the population. And we understand this. We sort of I got taught that in medical school. I thought it was completely ridiculous, but that's just what it was, and you just move on. Well, that's just what it is. But we don't address these things. We don't think about these things as an average. We think about them as the optimal. So, we get our patients and we say like, oh, the numbers in the black, that's all good. I can ignore all those. Oh, that one's red. I'll deal with it, right? So that is wrong, because we're thinking that this range is optimal. And so outside of that range is suboptimal. But that's not what that range is. We're treating it as an optimal range, but it is an average range. So I know I'm speaking to some patients here that the reference range for B12 went up to 540. And so they were in that, and they were great. They were like 250. Oh, that's lovely. It's right in there, from 130 to 540. Well, we actually know that under 400 can actually cause demyelination of your axons and cause nerve damage. There's a study out of Oxford in 2008 that showed that people in a range of 180 to 320 on annual MRIs after 5 years, their brains shrank by 5% volume, right? And that's in that range, right? It wasn't even below the range. They were in the range. So I just see that a lot of people have these low sort of levels starting out. I do see them come up, but that is one thing that I do check. I just make sure it's coming up fast enough. If someone is under 400, I will give them an injection, just bump them up. And some people have absorption issues. Some people have pernicious anemia. That's another autoimmune issue. If you have one autoimmune issue, you likely have other autoimmune issues. And so I see a lot of people with diabetics are going to be on metformin, as Dr. Unwin said. This can block out the absorption of different nutrients, such as B12. And so you might see people on the lower ends of this. And so I do keep track of that. Most everything goes in the right direction, but if their B12 is not really doing what it's supposed to, I try to find out why. And it might be an absorption issue, it might be a medication issue, it might be an autoimmune issue, but at least we recognize that, and if we need to keep up supplementation, we do. But that's not a carnivore keto thing, that's just a normal taking care of your patients thing.
B12 seems, certainly in my practice, a ton of people are B12, even just below the standard lab level. It's extremely common.
Yeah.
Extremely common. So
the ranges that we use, there are studies that actually look at people in their 20s who don't have medical issues, who are just healthy people in their 20s that aren't obese, don't have any diagnosed medical issues. Those reference ranges are remarkably different. And so even just using those, and then looking at research saying, okay, what is an optimal range? You get very different ranges. And so, you can address it, I think that would revolutionize medicine just right there. You get actual optimal reference ranges, and a doctor can look at this and go, oh, sweet Jesus, like this is all wrong. It's like field full of reds. And then you have something to work on. Because if your patient says, look, I'm feeling really unwell, let's do your bloods, everything comes back normal, you don't have a direction to go in. But if you see, wow, that's red, those are all up, that's something that we can do now. And so I have a lot of stuff that I can do with my patients, because most of them are going to be out of bounds on these sorts of things, because I use these optimal reference ranges. So the optimal reference ranges that we use for B12 in UK numbers would be 800 to 1200. So it's way above the range. I mean, the top. The top of the range here is 540. So if you don't have high B12, you are low, and that goes in America as well. So the reference range is different units that we would use would be 1100 to 1600, massively different than you would see in the normal reference ranges.
And we actually, in our private community, they send me their labs and stuff, and it's very common to see vitamin B6 and vitamin B12 in a carnivore that's actually above the reference range. Very common. And just one example, lady, her vitamin B6 was very high, vitamin B12 very high, not supplementing at all, just eating a carnivore diet. Went to her doctor, and her doctor said, "Oh my God, your B6 and B12 toxic. You need to stop carnivore right now."
Yeah.
Because the doctor didn't understand that these are average ranges. This is not optimal. And so that's a good example of there is a potentially unlimited amount of ignorance in the mind of some doctors. It can just be almost infinite, because he had never even stopped to consider, what does this reference range actually mean? How is that gleaned? Where did it come from? Most doctors don't think about that at all. And so she was scared to death, messaging me saying, I'm toxic. And Dr. Chaffee and I would say, no, honey, you're optimal. Congratulations, huzzah.
I mean, this information is extremely important, though, because patients do worry if something's outside the normal, and if they're getting great sleep, maybe they've significantly improved their inflammatory bowel disease, and then that might be enough to throw them off.
Correct. Yeah. And they get scared off by a lot of these different things, and that's a major one. I've had patients come back to me saying the same thing as well. I always prep them and say, this is why I'm saying that. One lady went in that, and she was so excited about this. She was look, these reference ranges, they're all off this. And he was just like, no, that's ridiculous. No. Well, then why are they different everywhere you go? Well, your environment, that makes a difference. It's like, well, no, if I'm here in Australia and my B12 is 600, that's normal, but I go to the UK and now it's toxic too high. So why is that? I'm the same person. What does the environment matter? But the environment of London apparently matters, because it's like every single clinic has a different reference range. So that was a bit surprising to me. And so she just was listening to him, and she was just getting an earful of it. And she just said, okay, and just like took her words, stacked them up, and she just never went back. She's like, okay, well, this guy's not working with the correct information.
Thanks, Trudi.
Okay, so we know that protein's made up of amino acids, and there's 9 essential amino acids, and meat is very high in the essential amino acid, methionine. And if you read the Longevity Solution by Jason Fung, or Eat Rich, Live Long by Ivor Cummins, they both say there's a sweet spot for protein intake, and if we consume too much protein, it switches on the mtor activation pathway and also IGF-1, and that can increase aging and also increase risk of cancer. And so what's your thought as Peter Attia doesn't believe that. He thinks that we should have more protein as we get older. There's some researchers that think that we should have a higher protein diet as we're younger because it increases fertility, but that we should reduce our protein intake as we get older to support longevity. So how does the carnivore diet fit into this idea that the too much protein being aging and reduces longevity?
I mean, too much is too much, right? But I think that, as we age, we should definitely get enough protein, because it protects against sarcopenia, and that's a major, has very strong associations with lower longevity. I think that a lot of this stuff is you miss the side of the forest for the trees. You're just saying, okay, well, mtor, this is everything. Well, mtor is one piece in a multi-trillion piece puzzle. It is very complex. It doesn't matter just if mTOR is on or off. It matters if mTOR is on and all these other things are on or off as well, and that changes how genes are expressed and how your cells function. So it's just one part of a very big and important puzzle. But we're going back to first principles. This is the proper human diet. This is what we've been eating for millions of years. This is what we are biologically adapted for. So whatever happens to mTOR when we eat our biologically appropriate diet is supposed to happen. Right, and so that's the principles I go on, and so methionine, all these sorts of things, it's supposed to be there. It's supposed to be in there in those proportions, and so that's what we want. So I work on those principles mainly. Yeah.
And a lot of people go on carnivore. Do they have periods of fasting? Because obviously that then reduces mTOR. So does it kind of balance out? So when people go carnivore, do they reduce their kind of the frequency of meals in a day?
Oh, you don't have to fast. I mean, but people tend to be less hungry and eat less often. If you're eating high density nutrition, you don't need to eat as much or as often. We know about carbohydrates, that raises insulin. Insulin affects over 100 different things in our body. One of them is leptin, is our satiety hormone, and that gets blocked. Lectins can also block leptin, and so your brain thinks that you're starving. This can come from our stretch receptors in our stomach. The majority comes from our adipose tissue. That tells our brain basically how much energy we have. It's like a running gas gauge. So that says, oh, we have enough. And then you block that, and your brain thinks, oh, we don't have anything. We need more energy. And because insulin's up, you've stopped your body's ability to mobilize fat, and now your blood sugar is dropping. And you get panic signal that says, hey, we have to eat, we're going to die. And so we overeat. And so we can't listen to our hunger signals like the koala can. We're getting told to eat constantly. So that's inappropriate. So eating an inappropriate diet, you're going to have an artificially elevated hunger signal, and you're going to overeat.
And talking about insulin, when an individual is insulin resistant and they have a high protein diet, because protein can stimulate insulin secretion, do you worry about them becoming more hyperinsulinic and therefore kind of generating lipogenesis and putting them into fat storage mode?
All my patients are eating a lot of fat because I stress that very specifically. Speaking to biochemists and professors of the same, such as Ben Bickman, if you're eating protein with carbohydrates, it has a higher glycemic index. But if you're eating protein just on its own, no carbohydrates, it has a much lower glycemic index, much lower insulin response as well. So I don't typically see that, but I also tell people that you need to eat the fat. It's very important. And by the time, now you can have sort of, U-shaped curve. So on the really low protein side, you can get, watery diarrhea. But you get on the high end of a high fat diet, your body can only absorb a certain amount of fat based on the amount of bile that you have. And after that, it's a small amount, but it's like single-digit percentages of fat, mostly MCTs that get absorbed without bile. So the rest of it has to come out. That's where the phrase, quicker than fat through a goose comes from. You can goose a piece of fat and it just comes right out, right? And that happens with us. We absorb what we can, and then the rest comes out. So you can get loose stools on that side too. So going away from that, if you're not getting enough fat and you're absorbing absolutely everything, you can get constipated. So I say, okay, just make sure you're eating enough fat that you're not getting constipated, and aim for this range, 1 to 2 grams of fat for every 1 gram of protein, and then see what your body needs, what your body is asking you for. And so I don't run into people having those issues, but I also am very careful about educating my patients on how to approach it.
Ken, you look like you're going to fire with something.
I was just wondering if any of the koalas, do you think they eat only eucalyptus leaves, right? Do you think there's one koala that's bitching because their diet's so restrictive? It's like, this restrictive. No, I doubt that. Actually, to your point, I think the mTOR thing I think that's evidence of focusing in on a very specific part of biochemistry that you do not have complete understanding of. I think that cell and molecular biology is probably beyond the capacity of any one human mind to understand. And you can focus in on one little aspect of it, mTOR, TMAO, the list goes on and on and on, and you wind up sounding very smart, but not saying a damn thing worth repeating. And I think that's what's going on here. I predict, I'd love your input on this, I predict that we will never have a complete understanding of the mechanism of human cellular biology and microbiology as human beings. It will take AI to ever fully comprehend everything that's going on in human biochemistry and molecular biology. Do you agree with that, Doctor? There will never be a single human who gets it all. It's too much.
Yeah, the levels of complexity are just, there are multiple layers.
Exactly,
layer
right.
On layer on
Right.
layer.
Yeah, and
vertical interactions.
yeah, and in my experience, when you hear any guru out there with any number of initials behind their name, when they're focusing in on one thing like mTOR, this mTOR, you can probably hit the unfollow button right there. Because what Dr. Chaffee and I are talking about these are huge, overarching, almost philosophical things that when you've got 300,000 years of anthropological research, and if you go talk to a group of anthropologists, and you say, you know, people should eat predominantly plants, it's a chuckle fest. They're like, okay, yeah, because that's dumb, because their research shows clearly that we were super carnivores, meaning 70% of our energy comes from food, was from meat and seafood and eggs and things that used to run, creep, crawl, slither, or fly. That's what we chased down and ate. All of the tools, you know, all the stone tools, you know, the Stone Age, all the stone tools. You know another word for tool? Weapon. Every single stone tool is a weapon for killing animals and cutting them up to eat, almost without exception. And wood does not preserve in the archaeological record, anthropological record. But now we're starting to find other ways to see, oh gosh, we had spears 300,000 years ago. We were probably using that to hoe the potatoes with.